So we're going to look at the artist Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp. And he's really going to be the focus of our discussion. He's really the most well-known Dadaist out there and lays the groundwork, as I've mentioned, not just for Dada, but I think for conceptualism and for just 20th century art in general. So he's a pretty big deal. When I decided to become a contemporary art historian, basically my advisor was like, yeah, so you really need to know everything about Duchamp, period. If you're going to say you teach contemporary art to people, you got to know where the source comes from, and it's from this man. Although you'll notice that Duchamp was also revolutionary for his time because he tried to reinvent how to think about everything, not just art, about pretty much everything, identity, construction. He was really very revolutionary, right, in all ways possible. So here you have actually his portrait as his alter ego, Eros c'est la vie, which was taken by the artist Man Ray, who was also a Dadaist, but actually went on to do more so photography. So if you study photo history, you're going to run into Man Ray quite a bit more than you do in Dada, let's say. But he took this photo of Duchamp's alter ego. And Duchamp loved this idea of having his masculine identity of Marcel Duchamp and then having his feminine identity of Eros c'est la vie. And he actually made art as both people, both identities, right? And he was very specific about how he would interact with people in each of his identities. Like, so if you saw him as Marcel Duchamp, and you try to ask him about Eros c'est la vie's work, like if you were like, so tell me about, this piece of art, he'd be like, well, you'd have to ask Eros about that. And Duchamp was French, by the way, and emigrated to America. So you'll notice I often talk like him, like he has a French accent because he was French. But he would be like, oh, qu'est-ce que c'est? I would not know what, Eros was thinking, you would have to ask her. And the same thing, vice versa. Like if he was as Eros and they said, well, tell me about this piece you made as Marcel Duchamp, he'd be like, well, you must ask Marcel about that, right? So he played very much, that he was that identity when he was inhabiting that identity. And Eros c'est la vie, if you translate it from the French, Eros is like passion, sex, it's not really love, that's amour, right? And c'est la vie is life, right? So c'est la vie is actually something, French people say all the time. It literally means that's life. They say it more so like, well, that's just how things are, or like whatever, So if you're talking to someone who's French, and they'll just be like, c'est la vie, like, whatever. So, to me, he's saying sort of like passion is the life, that's what the name means. And we'll talk about his fascination with word puns because, again, he was French and then came to live in America. So he often played these word puns with French and English, which was also part of the fun of his work, I think. But I think he's one of the first people to consider, like, is gender biological? Is gender choice? Is gender presentation? Is gender identity? A lot of the questions that I think are being asked today, he was asking then, right? He was asking, in the 1820s, right? He was asking these kind of questions. So we often, when people talk about identity art, they often go all the way back to Duchamp and say you have to consider what he was doing, and think about this idea of what does this mean for like trans people and such today. So again, he's the father of a lot of things, I often say. And I also say that Duchamp was a consummate game player. One of the things I love about his art is that he was always playing games with people. He was always up to something. And I enjoy this because I love strategy, I love game playing, I love politics. So for me, I have a little bit of like, he's my spirit animal when I think of Duchamp. And he played chess throughout his life and applied a lot of the strategy of chess playing to how he made his art or how he used basically publicity regarding his art. He would do different things. For instance, there's the famous story about him saying he was retiring from art to play chess. Like later in his life, he was like, I'm going to retire from art and I'm just going to play chess for the rest of my life. And people were like, okay. And then when he dies, it comes to be revealed that he was working on this piece of art like the whole time. So it's like, ah, you shifty little Frenchman. So he often would do these little ruses or these little games. And again, he loved a pun. He loved to play with words. He loved to play with the idea of like what words meant, or if you read something a certain way, it meant something different. Like Eros c'est la vie. If you don't know French, you'd be like, what's that mean? If you know French, he's telling you something. So he loved this idea of embedded messages or hidden messages. And again, I find that quite fascinating about him as well. Now, one of the things my students often say when they're getting critical about modern and contemporary works is they'll often say stuff like, oh, it looks like my kid could make it, or just they'll attack technique, right? They'll sort of act as if the technique is poor, then that doesn't make it valid art. And I'm like, okay, here's something. Marcel Duchamp was a trained painter. He was trained draftsman, trained painter, and you can look up his older works, his first works he made, and they're very typical type of things, landscapes, everything you'd expect like an artist who's learning to paint, right? But he basically said, look, that's boring. And that's what I think is really interesting about Dada and why Dada breaks off, is Dada basically saying, this has been done before. Painting has been done to death. Like, what else is there to do? Cubists have fractured form. Futurists have thought about energy as paint. Like, what else is there to do? Kandinsky and his non-representation. Like, all these frontiers have already been broken. And so people like Duchamp are like, well, I don't really want to be a traditional painter anymore because that doesn't hold anything for me. But one of the things I always make sure my students understand is they're classically trained in a lot of ways. And notice that the sort of middle of Duchamp's progression is this painting you see here, Nude Descending the Staircase. So when he starts to break away from traditional painting, notice what he goes towards. He goes towards more like a cubist-inspired idea, which became the scandal of this show in New York called the Armory Show. Notice that a critic called it an explosion in a shingle factory, which I love. But it was him taking the classical idea of a nude, and think about how nudes have always been presented in art. They've always been presented as these beautiful women laying on couches, giving you the come hither look. And he makes it almost look like a robot, or this sort of cubist Brockian nightmare, Go back and look at the Portuguese, right, from analytical cubism. He's taking those kind of markers, right, and kind of reinventing them. And again, this is what the show normally looked like. Very straightforward paintings and sculptures and such, although you do have Constantine Brancusi down there on the bottom left, who was considered sort of a weirdo sculptor. You can go look at him if you want. But, this was considered very, very odd stuff. But Duchamp was like, this isn't even weird. I'm not even getting weird for you yet, right? This is a comic, by the way, making fun of the painting in the New York papers, right? The Rude Descending the Staircase, right? But Duchamp was like, look, I haven't even gotten weird on you yet. But again, I want to dissuade you of the notion that, he didn't know how to paint or he didn't know how to be a classical artist, No, he was trained, he understood. He basically was like, all of this is boring, all of this has been done. Even Nude Descending the Staircase that made such a splash, he was like, it's basically just, recycled cubism and futurism. I want to do something different. And what he decides to do is what we call the ready-made. And to me, it's what Dada is really built on. It's built on the idea of not having to be trained technically, as I mentioned in the first part of the video. That, you don't have to be a good draftsperson. You don't have to have, technical skill. You can have ideas. And that's all that's necessary, right, for you to be an artist. So where Duchamp, to me, makes the jump to true Dadaism is when he starts to make ready-mades. And what's a ready-made? It's a ready-made object. You're looking at a urinal here. That he calls, of course, lyrically, the fountain. But it's a urinal. But all he basically did was buy a pre-made, industrially made urinal and make it his own. That's all he did. So when I told you, make your own Dada sculpture, get out the cat food cans, get out the toilet brush, this is what I was talking about. This is what Dada is about. And they would say that it doesn't matter that he didn't make it. He selected it. He picked it. So it's his idea. And that's all there is to it. I love it. Duchamp also did this to make a statement. He was part of a group called the Société Anonyme, which means the Anonymous Society. So once he had left France and came to New York, right, he was part of this group, and they were going to put on a show. And the group was like, let's not have a jury. And I've mentioned a little bit about juries before. They're usually used to select artwork. It's usually at least 3 people, because you have to have a tiebreaker. And the art would come before the jury, and they would decide if the art was worthy or not worthy. So this group says, well, that's just so bourgeois, right? We don't need to do that. Quality and judgment. We want to be above all those things, right? We want to be liberated, and we want to be open to art, right? And so we're not going to have a jury. We're going to let anything be shown. Well, this is a recipe for disaster, right? Well, Duchamp is part of this group. And of course, his little French mind starts going, his little punster mind, his little game player mind starts going, and he's like, will they show anything? So he picks this, and you'll notice he submits it under a pseudonym, R. Mutt. The work comes before the group, because even though there wasn't a jury, they still looked at every object they were bringing in for the show. Guess what the group said when they saw the fountain? They were like, mon Dieu, right? That's French, like for my God, right? All the people started being like, oh my God, it's a toilet. Like, we can't show a toilet. Like, no, absolutely not. This is in such poor taste, bad taste, we can't. And of course, Duchamp steps up. This is all lore at this point, right? This has all been handed down orally, but supposedly this all happened. Duchamp then steps up and says, oh, but who are we to say that Mr. Mutt is not an artist? This was his choice. This was his selection. This is what he wanted. Can you imagine? In his head, he's like laughing. So he's like, well, I'm him, But think of what he's perpetuating on these people who were saying they were so liberal and they were so open, right? Oh, and we'll show anything. He basically is illustrating that everybody has a line. We think we're open. We think we're, anything goes. But there's always a line that all of us have that basically we go, yeah, but that's too far. So he was using this piece in a way to show their hypocrisy. He was showing that they're hypocrites. They said they'll show anything, and now they're freaking out about this toilet, right? Do you think they showed it? They did not. So this is the only photograph we actually have of the fountain, the original fountain. You'll notice that there are tags on it. That's the intake tags, as we call them, where it comes in. It's like labeled, right? We call it ascensioning, so we bring it in and we label it so we don't lose track of things, right? But the funny part is the photograph was taken, and then after that, no one saw the fountain ever again. So we wonder if it just ended up in the trash somewhere, like what happened to it? So if you actually see the fountain in museums, you have to think about the fact that the fountain is actually a replica. Go down the rabbit hole on that one. Because Duchamp didn't make this one originally. And if you see it in museums, right, he didn't make that one either. So again, you kind of go further and further down the rabbit hole of like, what does it take, right, to make art? So I ask you the question, what makes it art, right? Because basically, Duchamp introduces this whole new idea of selection. And sort of, again, opens a door that people at that time aren't even willing to walk through yet, right? And here's the fun part, is he kept the secret of him being R. Mutt through his whole life. When he started making other ready-mades, like the ones you see here, he actually just kept talking about how inspired he was with R. Mutt's work. But it wasn't until he died and then people were reading through his diaries that they were like, oh, you shifty Frenchman, you bastard, right? Oh, he's so crafty. So he keeps the secret his whole life. So that's another thing I love about Duchamp, is that he was committed to a joke to the death, where today people would not be able to make it that long. They would be like, well, it was me, I had to take credit, there'd be no way. But he was like, no, the payoff, it's great, that no one knows it's me. Nobody knows that this was my joke, and so he kind of proves a point about what can be art and what can't be art, and again, he starts to make these other ready-mades, right, as well. As I mentioned, if you see the fountain in a museum, here you are at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which has a huge collection of Duchamp pieces. It's a great place to go if you love Duchamp. You'll see there's a fountain there. but it's basically another toilet that somebody bought and put on a pedestal. So that's the heart of the ready-made, because it's an idea. It's not really the object. But notice we still go to the museum and look at the objects. So it's this kind of, crazy thing that it does in your head, to me, like what Dada really does in your head. But again, he comes up with this idea of the ready-made. He also, later in his life, starts doing what he calls assisted ready-mades. And here we get into how he played with language. Because if you're reading it in English, you'd read this as L-H-O-O-Q. But if you speak French, you know that in French, the letters sound like la-h-o-o-cool. That's how you'd say it. If you say it really fast, la-h-o-o-cool, 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 it kind of sounds like Ella showed a cool, which means she has a hot ass. So again, it's much better when you speak French. And all it is a postcard of the Mona Lisa. I told you you'd see her again. And he writes on the bottom, L-H-O-O-Q, or La-H-O-O-Cool, and he gives her a little mustache, right, and a little goatee that he draws on the postcard. So we'd call this an assisted ready-made, because he assisted the image, right? And I'd mentioned to you before that, a lot of people have questions about the Mona Lisa, like, is it Leonardo and Drake? What's going on here? And I'll leave it to you to ponder if this changes your mind a bit about the theories there. But I think also for Duchamp, he was enthralled with the idea of gender and identity as well because of Eros C'est la Vie. So this is a little bit of commentary on his part, right, on those issues. So again, I love this idea of just taking everyday objects and kind of reinventing them. And that's really the spirit to me of what Dada is. Some other pieces from Dada, just quickly. Again, Duchamp's kind of the big daddy. But this is a piece by Schomburg called God. And I love showing you this one because I want you to think about like how, a lot of this art starts to somewhat cross boundaries for people, right? The title of this could be viewed as very irreverent and unacceptable. It's a piece of plumbing, right? Toilets and plumbing and, and I also want to mention that a lot of times what we see artists doing is being collaborative. So, for instance, this piece was made in conjunction with the Baroness Else von Freytag Loringhoven. It's a mouthful of a name. But the Baroness, she had come to America, and she was kind of a meal ticket for a lot of the Dada artists, but also thought of herself as an artist as well. So just like me with my grad school friends, she was like, well, I'd like to make art. I'd like to have ideas and think things up. And so collaboration becomes much more, I think, available when idea is driving the art, right? So we have to consider that a little bit as we move forward in the class together as well. Here's Man Ray. As I mentioned, we usually encounter him more as a photographer, but he also did make some Dada objects. This is a pretty terrible gift. It's an iron with spikes in it, so terrible, terrible for your laundry, but, gives you a Dada chuckle a little bit. And notice a lot of what Dadists would do is take, again, these ready-made objects and alter them or assist them in different kinds of ways in order to make something new. And then I always leave you with this piece by Sufo, because if you think about how you interact with art in a museum, or how I see people interact with art in museums, and one of the reasons I wanted to become an art historian is that I thought art could be fun. To me, art, doesn't have to be this stuffy, elite thing. That's why I teach at a community college, too, to be honest, because, again, I wanted to bring art to a very wide audience, right? A diverse audience. I was interested in that, but I think art sometimes comes off as stuffy. And if you think about going to galleries and how often people will be mingling around with their wine and cheese, right? And they'll look at a piece from far away, sort of talk about things like, I love how the artist used color here, right? And these little stories. And then they walk up and they usually read the tag. So imagine you're looking at this piece, because it's a mirror, and you're saying something like, sounds witty, right? I can imagine hearing people at a gallery like, I wonder if the artist was asking us to look inside our own soul, or, something like that. And then they walk up to the tag, and what does it say? It's a portrait of an imbecile. So the art piece literally like assaults you. Like, it's like, you're like, hey, not an imbecile. But again, I think that Dadists, they're always sort of like, we want to have fun. We want there to be a pun. We want there to be reinvention. And we want to think outside the box of like making stuff. We want to think about the ideas that drive the artworks. Next, we're going to be looking at surrealism. And again, a lot of Dadaists will move over into surrealism because surrealism will go a little bit further. They'll be looking at like dreams in the unconscious mind. So they're two different movements, but you'll notice that they have a lot of shared qualities within them.